Abel Mikkelsen Clemenson was born in 1971 in Narsaq, southern Greenland. He was of Inuit ethnicity. At the time of the massacre, Clemenson was 18 years old and a student. Limited information is available about Clemenson's childhood and family background. He lived with his parents in Narsaq. The family owned firearms, which was common in Greenland, where hunting was a traditional way of life for the Inuit population. Clemenson had at least one brother who lived in Narsaq. Both brothers attended social events in the small town where most residents knew each other. By accounts available, Clemenson was described as a laid-back young man before the massacre. There were no publicly reported incidents of prior criminal behavior or violence. He was a student and participated in the social life of Narsaq, like other young people his age. Narsaq is located in southern Greenland, in the municipality of Kujalleq, approximately 250 miles south of Greenland's capital Nuuk. The name Narsaq means plain in Kalaallisut, referring to the shore of Tunuliarfik Fjord where the town is located. In 1990, Narsaq had a population of approximately 1,500 to 2,000 residents, making it one of the largest towns in Greenland. The town is overwhelmingly Inuit in ethnicity. Narsaq contained one small hospital, a police station, and other basic municipal services. The economy of Narsaq was based on fishing and hunting. The Royal Greenland Prawn and Fishing Factory, established in 1953, was a major employer until its closure in 2010. The wider Narsaq area also supported sheep farming on the plains north of the town. Greenland is a home rule territory of Denmark, with a total population of approximately 54,000 in 1990. The island is the world's largest island. Greenland has a relatively high murder rate compared to Denmark. In 1989, there were 18 homicides in all of Greenland. Traditional Inuit society approached crime and punishment differently from Western European models. Historically, punishment for crimes was lenient because everyone was needed to survive in the harsh, isolated Arctic environment of Greenland. Community cohesion was essential for survival. By the late 20th century, Greenland's justice system reflected this cultural heritage. Perpetrators of even relatively serious crimes often were allowed to serve their sentences in open or semi-open prisons and institutions in Greenland. Those considered a significant risk to society were transferred to closed prisons in Denmark. A.C. Lust prison was later built in Greenland's capital. But in 1990, no such facility existed in Greenland. Firearms were widespread in Greenland. Much of the population lived from fishing and hunting seal and other game. Laws restricting ownership and storage of firearms were very light compared to Denmark's regulations. Hunting rifles and other weapons were common household items. Greenland's Inuit communities had experienced profound social disruptions from rapid modernization. The shift from traditional nomadic hunting lifestyles to sedentary, urbanized living contributed to elevated rates of substance abuse, family breakdown, and interpersonal violence. These transitions eroded historical social controls and kinship networks that once mitigated conflict. Psychosocial stressors such as isolation and loss of purpose were linked to increased aggression and self-destructive behaviors. Alcohol consumption was prevalent and played a role in violence. Studies from the 1980s indicated that 81% of violent injuries nationwide involved intoxication. Alcohol abuse was identified as a central causal factor in Greenlandic violence. December 31, 1989 was New Year's Eve. In Narsaq, as in many communities, residents prepared to celebrate the turn of the year from 1989 to 1990. A New Year's Eve party was organized in a boarding house complex in the Ungbo area of Narsaq. The boarding house was being used as a club for the celebration. The party took place during the polar night, when Narsaq experiences extended darkness during winter months. The celebration was typical of holiday gatherings in isolated Arctic communities. Local residents attended, including young people and adults. Alcohol was consumed as part of the festivities. Abel Clemenson attended the New Year's Eve party at the boarding house complex. His brother was also present at the party. Clemenson's best friend attended the celebration as well. The party took place in multiple rooms of the boarding house. Attendees socialized, drank, and celebrated together as the year turned from 1989 to 1990. At some point during or shortly after the turn of the year, a dispute occurred between Abel Clemenson and his best friend. The argument centered on a girl who was present at the party. According to available information, Clemenson was angry at this girl. His best friend took the girl's side in whatever conflict had arisen. Clemenson felt betrayed that his best friend had sided with the girl against him rather than supporting him. The nature of the initial conflict with the girl, and the specific details of what the best friend said or did to support her, are not detailed in available records. What is documented is that Clemenson perceived his best friend's actions as a betrayal. Following the dispute with his best friend, Abel Clemenson left the New Year's Eve party. He departed the boarding house complex and went home to his parents' house. At this point, other partygoers may not have thought much of Clemenson's departure. Arguments at parties where alcohol is consumed are not uncommon. Many people may have assumed Clemenson simply went home for the night. At his parents' home, Clemenson made a decision. According to later testimony and investigation, he formed the intention to return to the party with a weapon. His stated plan was to kill all attendants of the party and then commit suicide. Clemenson retrieved a semi-automatic rifle from his parents' house. This was a hunting rifle, the type of weapon commonly owned by Greenlandic families for hunting seal and other game. With the rifle, Clemenson returned to the boarding house complex, where the New Year's party was continuing. In the early hours of January 1, 1990, Abel Clemenson returned to the boarding house complex in Ungbo, where the New Year's party was taking place. He was armed with the semi-automatic rifle from his parents' home. Clemenson entered the boarding house. Partygoers were in rooms on the first floor of the building. Clemenson went to these rooms where people were gathered. Abel Clemenson opened fire on the attendees of the New Year's party. He fired systematically at people in 2 rooms on the first floor of the boarding house complex. Clemenson shot victims in the head with the rifle. The shooting was methodical and deadly. He moved through the rooms firing at partygoers. Among those shot was Clemenson's own brother. The brother was struck by a bullet through the cheek but survived the wound. 7 people were killed during the shooting. All victims were Inuit, as was the perpetrator. The deceased were 3 men aged 18, 33, and 34 years old, and 4 women aged 18, 19, 26, and 29 years old. All 7 victims died from gunshot wounds to the head. 1 additional person, a 22-year-old man, was critically wounded. He sustained head wounds but survived. 5 victims died at the scene. 2 others died hours later after being transported to the small hospital in Narsaq. The boarding house complex became a crime scene. The bodies of 7 young people lay in the rooms where moments before they had been celebrating the new year. Blood and evidence of violence marked the scene. Clemenson's brother, though wounded, survived and would later provide testimony about the events. The wounded 22-year-old man also survived despite severe injuries. After the shooting, Abel Clemenson did not commit suicide, as he had stated he intended to do. Instead, he was arrested by police. The small police force in Narsaq responded to the scene. Given the scale of the violence and the number of victims, this was by far the worst crime in the town's history, and one of the worst in all of Greenland. The news of the massacre spread rapidly through Narsaq. In a town of fewer than 2,000 people, nearly everyone knew at least some of the victims, the perpetrator, or both. The shooting occurred during what should have been a joyful celebration of the new year. Instead, it became the deadliest night in the town's history. Emergency services transported the wounded to Narsaq's small hospital. 2 victims who initially survived the shooting died there from their injuries within hours. The massacre left 8 people shot, 7 dead, and a community in shock and grief. Families who had sent their children, siblings, or parents to a New Year's party received news that they had been killed or critically injured. The crime scene was processed by local police with whatever resources were available in the small Arctic town. The investigation would need to establish exactly what had happened, who had been killed, and the sequence of events. Abel Clemenson was taken into custody by Narsaq police. He was held in the local police station, pending investigation and charging. Given Greenland's limited secure detention facilities, arrangements had to be made for Clemenson's detention. Greenland in 1990 did not have a closed, secure prison capable of holding someone accused of multiple murders. Police interviewed witnesses who had been at the party and survived the shooting. Clemenson's brother, despite being wounded, was able to provide information about the events leading up to the massacre and the shooting itself. The wounded 22-year-old survivor was also interviewed when his condition permitted. Other partygoers who had escaped injury described the events of the night, the dispute between Clemenson and his friend, and Clemenson's departure and return with the rifle. During questioning, Abel Clemenson confessed to the shootings. He admitted returning to the party with the rifle and opening fire on the attendees. He explained that he had intended to kill everyone at the party and then commit suicide. Clemenson described his motivation as anger and a sense of betrayal. He felt his best friend had sided with a girl against him during an argument. This perceived betrayal triggered his decision to carry out the massacre. The confession was documented and would form a central part of the prosecution's case against him. Abel Clemenson was formally charged with 7 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The charges reflected the 7 people killed and the 22-year-old man who survived despite being shot. In Greenland, the prosecution of serious crimes followed Danish legal procedures, as Greenland was a home rule territory under Danish sovereignty. The case would be prosecuted under this legal framework. Given the severity of the charges and the defendant's dangerousness, Clemenson was transferred to detention facilities in Denmark. Greenland's open and semi-open prisons were not suitable for holding someone accused of such serious violent crimes. The investigation continued as prosecutors prepared their case. The physical evidence from the crime scene, witness testimony, and Clemenson's confession provided a clear picture of what had occurred at the New Year's party. During the investigation and pre-trial period, Abel Clemenson underwent psychiatric evaluation. These evaluations were necessary to determine his mental state at the time of the crimes and his criminal responsibility. Psychiatrists examined Clemenson and conducted assessments. They reviewed his background, the circumstances of the massacre, and his psychological state. The psychiatric evaluations concluded that Clemenson had a narcissistic personality disorder. This diagnosis indicated a pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy. Individuals with narcissistic personality disorder may react with extreme anger when they feel slighted or betrayed. The psychiatrist's findings suggested that Clemenson's perceived betrayal by his best friend had triggered a narcissistic rage. Combined with alcohol consumption at the party and access to firearms, this created the conditions for the massacre. However, the psychiatric evaluation also determined that Clemenson was criminally responsible for his actions. While he had a personality disorder, he was not psychotic or otherwise unable to understand right from wrong. He knew what he was doing when he returned to the party with the rifle. The psychiatric diagnosis would be important during sentencing, but did not constitute a defense against the charges. The trial of Abel Clemenson took place under Danish and Greenlandic legal procedures. Clemenson was represented by defense counsel appointed to his case. Given that Clemenson had confessed to the shootings, the trial focused less on establishing guilt and more on the circumstances, his mental state, and appropriate sentencing. The prosecution presented evidence of the massacre. This included testimony from surviving witnesses, medical evidence about the victims, injuries and causes of death, forensic evidence from the crime scene, and Clemenson's own confession. Prosecutors detailed the events of January 1, 1990. They described how Clemenson had attended the party, argued with his friend over a girl, left the party, retrieved a rifle from his parents' home, and returned to systematically shoot party attendees. The prosecution emphasized the premeditated nature of the attack. Clemenson had left the party, gone home, armed himself, and returned with the stated intention of killing everyone present. The methodical way he shot victims in the head in 2 different rooms demonstrated intent to kill. The prosecution also presented the impact of Clemenson's actions. 7 people were dead, 1 was severely wounded, families were devastated, and a small community was traumatized. Clemenson's defense did not dispute the facts of the case. He had confessed, and the evidence was overwhelming. Instead, the defense focused on mitigating factors that might influence sentencing. The defense presented evidence of Clemenson's background as a young man, without a history of violence. They emphasized that this was an isolated incident triggered by a specific conflict and perceived betrayal. The defense highlighted the psychiatric diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. They argued this helped explain Clemenson's extreme reaction to feeling betrayed by his friend. The defense also noted the context of the crime. The dispute occurred at a party where alcohol was being consumed. The triggering incident involved interpersonal conflict common among young people. The broader social context of Greenland's high rates of violence and social disruption was also mentioned. The defense's goal was to influence sentencing and placement rather than achieve acquittal. Given the confession and evidence, conviction was inevitable. Specific details of the trial proceedings are not extensively documented in available English-language sources. The trial was conducted under Danish and Greenlandic legal procedures. Given the confession and evidence, the trial likely focused on psychiatric testimony and sentencing recommendations, rather than on establishing guilt. Abel Clemenson was found guilty of the murders and attempted murder. The verdict was delivered in March 1991, approximately 14 months after the massacre. The court determined that Clemenson was criminally responsible for his actions despite his narcissistic personality disorder diagnosis. On March 1991, Abel Clemenson was sentenced. The court ordered indefinite detention at a psychiatric institution. This sentence reflected several considerations. The severity of the crime included 7 murders and 1 attempted murder. Clemenson's psychiatric diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder was taken into account. The need to protect public safety was paramount. The recognition that Clemenson required psychiatric treatment was important. The limitations of Greenland's prison system for housing dangerous offenders also influenced the decision. Indefinite detention meant Clemenson would be held until such time as psychiatric professionals and the justice system determined he no longer posed a danger to society. There was no fixed end date to his sentence. This type of sentence is used in cases where the offender's mental state makes risk assessment complex. Rather than a fixed term, the duration depends on psychiatric progress and risk evaluation. The court determined that Clemenson was too dangerous to be held in Greenland's open or semi-open prison facilities. Greenland did not have a closed, secure psychiatric facility appropriate for someone of Clemenson's risk level. Clemenson was transferred to Herstedvester, a prison with facilities for psychiatric treatment located in Denmark. Herstedvester is a secure facility designed to house and treat offenders with mental health issues who require both imprisonment and psychiatric care. This transfer removed Clemenson from Greenland and placed him in a Danish facility where he could be securely held while receiving treatment for his personality disorder. The massacre devastated the small community of Narsaq. In a town of fewer than 2,000 people, the loss of 7 residents in a single violent incident was profound. Nearly everyone in Narsaq knew the victims, the perpetrator, or both. The boarding house complex in Ungbo, where the massacre occurred, became a site of trauma for the community. The psychological impact on survivors, witnesses, families of victims, and the broader community was significant. The massacre prompted discussion in Greenland about violence, mental health, substance abuse, and the availability of firearms. However, firearms remained common and largely unregulated, due to their necessity for traditional hunting activities that remained central to Greenlandic culture and subsistence. The case highlighted the challenges facing Greenland's justice system in dealing with severe violent crimes. The lack of secure psychiatric facilities in Greenland meant that the most dangerous offenders had to be transferred to Denmark, removing them from their home territory and culture. Abel Clemenson spent approximately 25 years in detention at Herstedvester and potentially other Danish facilities. During this time, he received psychiatric treatment for his narcissistic personality disorder. The indefinite nature of his sentence meant that his release would depend on psychiatric evaluation of his risk to public safety and his progress in treatment. In 2015, approximately 25 years after the massacre, Abel Clemenson was released on parole. He was approximately 44 years old at the time of his release. The decision to grant parole indicated that psychiatric professionals and parole authorities determined that Clemenson no longer posed an unacceptable risk to public safety. The specific conditions of his parole are not detailed in available public records. In 2014, 1 year before his parole release, Clemenson was charged with smuggling hashish to Greenland. This charge occurred while he was still in detention or on supervised release. The drug smuggling charge suggested that Clemenson had maintained connections to Greenland during his detention in Denmark and had engaged in criminal activity even while under supervision. Details of this charge and its disposition are not extensively documented. Despite the drug charge, Clemenson was still granted parole in 2015. The parole board apparently determined that drug smuggling did not indicate the same level of violent risk as his original offenses. As of 2026, Abel Clemenson's current status and whereabouts are not publicly documented. He would be approximately 55 years old. Whether he remains in Greenland, Denmark, or elsewhere is not confirmed in available sources. The terms of his parole likely included conditions restricting his movements, requiring psychiatric follow-up, and possibly prohibiting contact with victims, families, or return to Narsaq. The Narsaq massacre remains the worst mass shooting in Greenland's history. More than 3 decades later, it stands as the deadliest single incident of violence in the territory. The case is studied in discussions of Arctic social issues, the impacts of rapid modernization on indigenous communities, substance abuse and violence in Greenland, and the challenges of operating a mama hand justice system in a small, isolated territory. For the families of the 7 victims, the massacre left permanent scars. For the survivor who was wounded, the trauma of being shot in the head at a New Year's party by someone he knew affected the rest of his life. For Narsaq, the massacre demonstrated that even in a small, close-knit Arctic community, extreme violence could erupt with devastating consequences. The Narsaq massacre occurred against a backdrop of social challenges facing Greenland and other Arctic indigenous communities. The transition from traditional lifestyles to modern urbanized living created social disruption, substance abuse problems, and elevated violence. Greenland's murder rate remained high relative to Denmark throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Violence, often associated with alcohol abuse, remained a significant public health and criminal justice issue. The case also highlighted the difficulty of preventing mass violence in communities where firearms are widespread and culturally important. Unlike in densely populated urban areas, Arctic communities rely on hunting for subsistence and cultural continuity, making firearm restrictions culturally problematic, even when they might reduce violence. The Narsaq massacre of January 1, 1990, remains a defining event in Greenland's modern history. A night when celebration turned to massacre, and a small Arctic town lost 7 of its residents to a young man's rage.